Picture this. You're a young woman in 13th century Europe. You've just given birth to your fourth child in 6 years, and your body is exhausted, malnourished, and barely surviving. The thought of another pregnancy fills you with genuine terror, because you know that in your world, every pregnancy is a potential death sentence. But here's what will make your blood run cold. The methods available to prevent that next pregnancy might be even more dangerous than childbirth itself. What you're about to hear are the real stories of medieval women who risked everything: their health, their lives, even their souls, to control their own fertility. These aren't just historical footnotes. These are the desperate measures taken by mothers, wives, and daughters who faced an impossible choice: risk death through pregnancy or risk death through prevention. Before we dive into these haunting tales from the past, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. We're exploring these ancient stories together, united by our shared curiosity about how our ancestors lived and survived. And if you find yourself captivated by these hidden histories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we're about to uncover some of the most shocking medical practices from the medieval world. To understand why medieval women would risk their lives with dangerous contraceptives, you first need to understand the brutal reality they faced. In medieval Europe, the average woman would become pregnant between 8 to 12 times during her reproductive years. But here's the devastating truth. Only about half of those children would survive to see their 5th birthday. And the mothers? 1 in every 10 would die in childbirth or from complications shortly after. But that statistic doesn't capture the full horror. For every woman who died, countless others suffered from prolapsed uteruses, infections, fistulas that left them incontinent, and injuries that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Eleanor of Provence knew this reality intimately. As the wife of King Henry III of England in the 13th century, she had access to the best medical care available. Yet even she watched 3 of her 5 children die young. But Eleanor's story isn't just about royal tragedy. It's about the impossible calculation every medieval woman had to make. Imagine the moment Eleanor, recovering from yet another difficult birth, realized she was pregnant again. The royal physicians would bow and offer congratulations. But behind her composed exterior, Eleanor was doing the deadly mathematics of medieval motherhood. Another pregnancy meant another roll of the dice with death. Yet the methods available to prevent it might prove just as lethal. This was the impossible choice that defined medieval women's lives: certain suffering through endless pregnancies, or uncertain death through desperate prevention. What happened next would reveal just how far women were willing to go to control their own destinies. In a small cottage on the outskirts of Rouen in 1348, a young woman named Marguerite was grinding seeds with shaking hands. The bitter almond scent of the crushed kernels filled the air as she worked by candlelight, her husband sleeping unaware in the next room. What Marguerite didn't know was that she was preparing a dose of cyanide that could kill her within hours. The seeds were from the wild carrot plant, Queen Anne's lace, and they represented the first line of defense for medieval women desperate to prevent pregnancy. But this innocent-looking wildflower harbored a deadly secret. The concentrated compounds in its seeds didn't just prevent conception, they attacked the central nervous system, causing seizures, respiratory failure, and often death. Medieval texts describe the preparation method with chilling precision. Take the seeds when the moon is new, grind them with wine, and consume immediately after the monthly courses. What this text failed to mention were the women like Marguerite who would begin convulsing within an hour of consuming the mixture. The dosage was everything, and medieval women had no way to measure it accurately. Too little, and pregnancy would continue. Too much, and death was almost certain. Contemporary chronicles tell us of entire households where women died mysteriously, their symptoms so similar to poisoning that their husbands were often accused of murder. But Queen Anne's lace was just the beginning. Medieval women also turned to pennyroyal, a member of the mint family that seemed deceptively harmless. The herb was easily recognizable and grew wild throughout Europe. What made it so appealing was that it actually worked. The compounds in pennyroyal could indeed terminate early pregnancies. The problem was that the effective dose and the lethal dose were dangerously close. Pennyroyal oil attacks the liver and kidneys with devastating efficiency. Women who consumed it would first experience violent nausea and abdominal pain. Then their skin would turn yellow as their liver began to fail. Death often came within days, but not before agonizing hours of internal bleeding. A surviving medical text from 12th century Salerno describes a woman brought to the physicians with great burning in her belly and blood flowing from her mouth. The description continues. She had taken the green herb for prevention of child, but the herb took her life instead. The physician's account is clinical, but you can imagine the terror of that nameless woman as she realized her attempt at family planning had become a death sentence. Even more horrifying was silphium, a plant so prized for its contraceptive properties that it was worth its weight in gold. Ancient sources describe it as a near-perfect birth control method, which is precisely why it was harvested to extinction by the medieval period. But the plants that desperate women substituted for true silphium were far more dangerous. Wild rue, often used as a silphium substitute, contains compounds that cause severe photosensitivity. Women who consumed it would develop horrific burns when exposed to sunlight, their skin blistering and peeling away in sheets. But the internal damage was even worse. Rue attacks the reproductive system so aggressively that it could cause permanent sterility or death from hemorrhaging. The tragedy is that these plants often worked exactly as intended. They prevented pregnancy. But the medieval understanding of dosage and preparation was so primitive that success and survival were largely matters of luck. For every woman who successfully avoided an unwanted pregnancy, another paid with her life. Yet, women continued to risk everything with these botanical roulette wheels because the alternative, endless pregnancies in a world without modern medicine, seemed even more terrifying. In their minds, they weren't choosing between life and death. They were choosing between different ways to die. In the shadowy chambers of a 14th century apothecary shop in Paris, a woman named Isabel was paying an enormous sum for a small vial of quicksilver, liquid mercury. The apothecary's hands trembled slightly as he handed her the gleaming, poisonous metal. knowing full well what she intended to do with it. What neither of them understood was that Isabel was about to poison herself with one of the most toxic substances known to mankind. Mercury had been used in various medical treatments since ancient times, but by the medieval period, it had gained a sinister reputation as a contraceptive. The logic seemed sound to medieval minds. Mercury was known to cause violent purging of the bowels, so surely it could purge an unwanted pregnancy as well. What they didn't understand was that mercury doesn't just attack the digestive system. It systematically destroys the brain, kidneys, and nervous system. Medieval women would consume mercury in various forms, sometimes mixed with wine, sometimes ground into powder and baked into bread. The immediate effects were horrific enough: violent vomiting, bloody diarrhea, and agonizing abdominal cramps. But these were just the beginning of mercury's assault on the human body. The mercury would begin accumulating in Isabel's brain tissue within hours of consumption. At first, she might have experienced confusion and mood swings. Her family probably attributed these symptoms to female hysteria or melancholy. But as days passed, the mercury would continue its deadly work. Her speech would become slurred, her hands would develop an uncontrollable tremor, and her personality would begin to change dramatically. Medieval chroniclers describe women who had consumed mercury as becoming possessed by demons or touched by madness. They would rant incoherently, suffer from hallucinations, and lose control of their bodily functions. What these observers were actually witnessing was severe mercury poisoning, brain damage so extensive that it fundamentally altered the victim's personality and cognitive abilities. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of mercury poisoning was how slowly it killed. Unlike the quick death that might come from consuming the wrong plant, mercury would condemn women to weeks or months of gradual deterioration. Their gums would turn black and their teeth would fall out. Their kidneys would begin to fail, causing their bodies to swell with retained fluid. And through it all, their minds would slowly slip away as the mercury destroyed their brain tissue. A medical text from the monastery of St. Gall describes a woman brought to the infirmary, speaking as a child, though her years be 30, and knowing not her own name or station. The monk physician notes that her mouth did stink of metal, and her hands did shake as leaves in wind. He was observing the final stages of mercury poisoning. A woman whose desperate attempt to control her fertility had robbed her of her sanity and would soon claim her life. What makes the mercury tragedy even more heartbreaking is that it rarely worked as intended. Mercury might cause miscarriage through sheer toxicity, but it was just as likely to cause birth defects in surviving pregnancies. Children born to mothers who had consumed mercury often suffered from developmental delays, physical deformities, and neurological problems. Yet women continued to seek out mercury because they had been told it was medicine. The apothecaries who sold it presented themselves as learned men with access to ancient wisdom. They spoke in Latin and surrounded themselves with the trappings of scholarship. How could desperate women know that these supposed healers were actually merchants of death? The mercury sellers knew the risks. Medical texts of the period warn about mercury's dangers. But the profits were enormous, and the customers were women with few legal rights and little social power. If a woman died from mercury poisoning, who would hold the apothecary accountable? Her husband might believe she died from natural causes, or he might be relieved to be rid of a wife who had been acting strangely. The true scope of mercury poisoning among medieval women will never be known because the symptoms were so easily misattributed to other causes. How many women labeled as mad or possessed were actually suffering from mercury poisoning? How many mysterious deaths in childbearing age women were actually the result of desperate attempts at birth control? What we do know is that mercury was readily available, aggressively marketed to women, and absolutely lethal. It represented the intersection of medieval medicine's arrogance and ignorance. The dangerous belief that any substance could be medicine if used by the right people in the right way. In a wealthy merchant's house in 14th century Florence, Caterina was secretly adding a white powder to her daily wine. The powder was sweet to the taste and dissolved completely, leaving no trace of what she was doing. Her husband and in-laws praised her for her improving appetite and better color, not realizing that Caterina was slowly poisoning herself with lead compounds. What started as an attempt to prevent pregnancy would end with her dying in agony, her mind destroyed, and her body racked with pain. Lard had been prized since Roman times for its ability to sweeten wine and preserve food. Medieval women discovered that lead compounds could also prevent pregnancy, but they had no understanding of how this seemingly harmless white powder was systematically destroying their bodies. Lead poisoning is insidious because it accumulates slowly, and its early symptoms can easily be mistaken for other conditions. Caterina probably began with small amounts of lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, for its sweet taste. Medieval texts describe it as a gentle remedy that would prevent the quickening of unwanted fruit in the womb. The instructions seemed simple enough. Dissolve a small amount in wine and drink it daily. What these texts didn't mention was that there was no safe dose of lead, and that even tiny amounts would begin accumulating in her bones, brain, and organs. At first, Caterina might have felt better than she had in months. Lead poisoning often begins with a period of apparent improvement. Victims report increased appetite, better sleep, and a general sense of well-being. This cruel irony meant that women would continue taking lead compounds even as they were slowly destroying their own bodies. But lead doesn't discriminate in its destruction. As weeks passed, Caterina would have begun experiencing the first warning signs: occasional stomach cramps, mild headaches, and unexplained fatigue. These symptoms were so common among medieval women who faced poor nutrition, frequent pregnancies, and endless physical labor that they would barely register as unusual. The real horror would come later. As the lead continued to accumulate in her system, medieval chroniclers describe women suffering from what they called the painter's sickness, a reference to the fact that artists who used lead-based paints often suffered similar symptoms. These women would develop severe abdominal pain that came in waves, leaving them doubled over and screaming. Their hands and feet would develop a characteristic wrist drop as the lead attacked their nervous system. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of lead poisoning was how it affected the mind. Caterina would have begun experiencing mood swings, confusion, and memory problems. Her family might have attributed these changes to female hysteria or demonic possession. As the lead levels in her brain increased, she would have developed full-blown encephalopathy, brain damage so severe that she would lose the ability to speak coherently or recognize familiar faces. A surviving letter from a 15th century Venetian merchant describes his wife's final days. "My beloved speaks words that make no sense and looks upon me as a stranger. Yesterday, she attempted to nurse a pillow, believing it her child. The physicians say it is a curse upon women who seek to thwart God's will." He was watching his wife die from lead poisoning, but medieval medicine had no name for what was killing her. The lead would attack every system in Katerina's body. Her kidneys would begin to fail, causing her to retain fluid and develop a gray, waxy complexion. Her red blood cells would be unable to carry oxygen effectively, leaving her constantly exhausted and short of breath. And through it all, the lead would continue accumulating in her bones, where it would remain long after her death. What makes the lead poisoning epidemic particularly tragic is that it often worked exactly as advertised. Lead compounds could indeed prevent pregnancy, but not through any mystical properties. Lead poisoning causes such severe damage to the reproductive system that pregnancy becomes impossible. Women who survived lead poisoning were often permanently sterile, their reproductive organs too damaged to function normally. The irony is devastating. In their attempts to control their fertility temporarily, these women were unknowingly sterilizing themselves permanently. And the lucky ones who became infertile quickly were spared the prolonged agony of those who continued taking lead compounds in increasingly desperate doses. Medieval medical texts from the period show that physicians were beginning to recognize a pattern. They noted that certain women developed similar symptoms: the abdominal pain, the mental confusion, the characteristic pallor. But they attributed these symptoms to moral failings rather than medical causes. Women who suffered from lead poisoning were often accused of witchcraft or consorting with demons. The supply chain for lead compounds was extensive and profitable. Apothecaries, merchants, and even some physicians actively promoted lead-based remedies to women. The white powder was easy to transport, had a long shelf life, and generated enormous profits. That it was slowly killing their customers was either unknown or deliberately ignored. What's most heartbreaking is that lead was so readily available that women could easily obtain it without arousing suspicion. It was used in cosmetics, food preparation, and household goods. A woman could purchase lead compounds under the pretense of needing them for cooking or cleaning, then use them in her desperate attempts to control her fertility. The true scope of lead poisoning among medieval women will never be known, because the symptoms developed so slowly and were so easily misattributed to other causes. How many women who died from mysterious wasting diseases were actually victims of lead poisoning? How many were accused of witchcraft because lead had damaged their minds and changed their personalities? In a dimly lit chamber in 13th century London, a woman named Agnes was preparing to insert a small piece of copper into her body. The local wise woman had assured her that copper possessed mystical properties that would prevent conception, and Agnes desperately needed to avoid another pregnancy. What neither woman understood was that copper, when placed inside the human body, could cause infections so severe that death would come within days. The use of copper as a contraceptive device represents one of medieval medicine's most dangerous misconceptions. Copper was known to have antimicrobial properties. It could indeed kill bacteria and other microorganisms. Medieval minds reasoned that if copper could kill harmful organisms, it might also prevent the seed from taking root in the womb. This logic seemed sound, but it failed to account for the human body's violent reaction to foreign metal objects. Agnes would have obtained her copper from a blacksmith or metal worker, probably in the form of a small disc or wire. The preparation instructions passed down through generations of women seemed simple enough. Shape the copper into a small object that could be inserted into the womb and leave it in place. What these instructions didn't mention was that copper would begin corroding immediately upon contact with bodily fluids, releasing toxic compounds directly into the reproductive tract. The immediate effects would have been agonizing. Copper causes severe tissue irritation and inflammation. Agnes would have experienced intense cramping, heavy bleeding, and a burning sensation that felt like fire inside her body. But these immediate symptoms were nothing compared to what would follow as bacteria began to colonize the corroding metal. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacterial infections, but they were intimately familiar with their effects. Agnes would have developed what they called the fire in the belly, a raging infection that would consume her from within. Her fever would spike to dangerous levels, and she would experience chills so severe that no amount of blankets could warm her. A surviving medical text from the Abbey of Fontevraud describes a woman brought to the nuns for treatment. She burns with fever, though the season be winter, and speaks of fire consuming her womb. When we examined her private parts, we found a green corruption and a stench most foul. The nuns were observing the effects of copper poisoning and severe bacterial infection, though they had no name for what they were seeing. The green corruption was particularly horrifying. Copper corrosion produces distinctive green and blue compounds that would stain Agnes's skin and clothing. These copper salts are highly toxic and would be absorbed into her bloodstream, causing systemic poisoning. She would develop a metallic taste in her mouth, and her saliva would turn green. Her urine would take on an alarming blue-green color as her kidneys struggled to filter the copper compounds from her blood. But the bacterial infection would ultimately prove more dangerous than the copper poisoning itself. Medieval women had no access to antibiotics, and their bodies' immune systems were often weakened by poor nutrition and repeated pregnancies. Once bacteria began growing on the corroding copper, the infection would spread rapidly throughout the reproductive tract and into the abdominal cavity. Agnes would have experienced what medieval physicians called the dying sickness, a condition where the body seemed to consume itself from within. Her abdomen would become distended and rigid as infection spread through her pelvis. The pain would be so severe that she would be unable to lie still, writhing in agony as the infection destroyed her internal organs. The smell would have been unbearable. Copper corrosion combined with bacterial infection produces an odor so distinctive and foul that medieval chroniclers compared it to rotting meat mixed with sulfur. Agnes's family would have known she was dying long before her other symptoms became apparent. simply from the stench emanating from her body. What makes the copper tragedy particularly heartbreaking is that it often worked exactly as intended, but at a horrific cost. The severe infection and tissue damage would indeed prevent pregnancy, but it would also destroy the woman's reproductive system entirely. Those lucky enough to survive copper poisoning were often left permanently sterile and in chronic pain. Medieval medical texts show that physicians were beginning to recognize copper as a dangerous substance. A 14th century manuscript warns that the green metal brings corruption to the womb and death to the woman. But this knowledge was largely confined to educated male physicians who had little contact with the women actually using these methods. The women who provided copper contraceptives were often midwives or wise women operating outside the formal medical establishment. They relied on oral tradition and personal experience rather than written texts. When a woman died from copper poisoning, the wise woman might blame the death on divine punishment or demonic interference rather than recognizing the role of the copper itself. The supply of copper was virtually unlimited. Medieval Europe was experiencing a boom in copper mining and metalworking. Copper was used for cooking pots, religious objects, and decorative items. A woman could easily obtain small pieces of copper without arousing suspicion, claiming she needed them for household purposes. What's most tragic is that copper-based contraceptives were often recommended by other women, mothers, sisters, and friends who genuinely believed they were sharing life-saving knowledge. These women had no way of knowing that they were recommending a method that was more likely to kill than to help. The psychological trauma for families was enormous. Agnes's husband and children would have watched her die slowly and agonizingly, never understanding why she had suddenly become ill. The green staining of her skin and the horrible smell would have made her final days a nightmare for everyone involved. Medieval society often blamed women themselves for these deaths. If a woman died mysteriously with symptoms of internal corruption, she might be accused of adultery, witchcraft, or moral failing. The idea that she had died trying to control her own fertility was literally unthinkable to many medieval minds. In a monastery infirmary in 12th century Germany, a young woman named Gisela was being strapped to a wooden table while a monk physician prepared his sharpest knife. Gisela had sought out the monastery's medical services because she had heard that bloodletting could prevent unwanted pregnancies. What she didn't understand was that the monks were about to drain so much blood from her body that she would never wake up again. Bloodletting was perhaps the most widespread medical practice in medieval Europe, used to treat everything from headaches to plague. The theory seemed logical to medieval minds. The body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An illness resulted from imbalances between these humors. Since pregnancy was caused by an excess of hot humors, removing blood should restore balance and prevent conception. For contraceptive purposes, bloodletting was considered especially effective because medieval physicians believed that menstrual blood and regular blood were essentially the same substance. If a woman's monthly bleeding could be artificially increased through bloodletting, they reasoned, her body would be too depleted to support a pregnancy. Gisela would have been subjected to what medieval texts called the Great Evacuation, a bloodletting session designed to remove as much blood as possible without immediately killing the patient. The monk physician would make deep cuts in her arms, neck, and sometimes even her femoral arteries. The goal was to drain away what they calculated to be nearly a quarter of her total blood volume. The immediate effects were devastating. As Gisela's blood pressure dropped, she would have experienced dizziness, nausea, and difficulty staying conscious. Her heart would race as it struggled to pump the remaining blood through her body. Her skin would turn pale, then grayish, as her organs began to shut down from lack of oxygen. Medieval physicians had no understanding of blood volume or circulation, but they could observe the effects of their procedures. A 13th century medical text describes a woman after extreme bloodletting. Her breath comes shallow and quick, and her skin is cold as winter stone. Though she lives, her spirit seems to have departed. They were observing the early stages of hypovolemic shock, a condition that would prove fatal without immediate blood replacement. But the bloodletting wasn't over after the initial session. Medieval medical theory called for repeated treatments to maintain the balance of humors. Gisela would be subjected to bloodletting every few days for weeks or months, each session weakening her further. Her body would never have a chance to recover between treatments. The tools used for bloodletting were primitive and often filthy. Monks and physicians used everything from rusty knives to broken pottery to open veins. These instruments were rarely cleaned between patients, and the concept of sterilization was unknown. Even if a woman survived the blood loss, she was likely to develop severe infections from contaminated cutting tools. A surviving chronicle from the Abbey of Cluny describes the death of a young woman who had sought bloodletting to prevent pregnancy. She came to us seeking healing, but the cure proved worse than any ailment. On the 7th day of bleeding, she spoke no more. On the 10th day, she breathed no more. We committed her soul to God's mercy. The monks were documenting a death from severe anemia and infection, though they understood neither condition. What made bloodletting particularly dangerous for women was that many were already anemic from poor nutrition and frequent pregnancies. Medieval diets were often deficient in iron, and women of childbearing age were especially vulnerable to iron deficiency. Removing large quantities of blood from an already anemic woman was essentially a death sentence. The blood loss would affect every organ system in Gisela's body. Her brain would be starved of oxygen, causing confusion, hallucinations, and eventually coma. Her kidneys would begin to fail as blood pressure dropped too low to filter waste effectively. Her heart would struggle and eventually give out as it tried to pump blood that was no longer there. Medieval physicians had crude methods for measuring blood loss, but they were wildly inaccurate. They might collect the blood in bowls and estimate volume, but much of it would be absorbed by cloths or spill onto the floor. As a result, they often removed far more blood than they intended, pushing patients into fatal shock without realizing what they had done. The psychological aspect of bloodletting was almost as traumatic as the physical effects. Women would be conscious during much of the procedure, watching their life force literally drain away. The sight of their own blood filling bowl after bowl would be terrifying, but they were told that this was necessary medicine. The trust required to submit to such a procedure speaks to the desperation these women felt. What's particularly tragic is that bloodletting often appeared to work in the short term. A woman who lost massive amounts of blood would indeed stop menstruating, not because her humors were balanced, but because her body no longer had enough blood to support normal reproductive functions. This cessation of menstruation was interpreted as proof that the treatment was working. But the absence of menstruation was actually a sign of severe illness, not health. Women who survived extreme bloodletting often remained weak and sickly for months or years afterward. Their bodies would struggle to produce new blood cells, and they would be susceptible to infections and other illnesses. Many never fully recovered their strength. The class dynamics of bloodletting were particularly cruel. Wealthy women might receive the services of educated physicians who used sharper, cleaner instruments and had some knowledge of anatomy. Poor women were more likely to be treated by barbers or untrained practitioners who might use whatever sharp objects were available. The same desperation that drove all women to seek bloodletting meant that poor women were exposed to even greater risks. Medieval medical texts show that some physicians were beginning to question the practice of extreme bloodletting for contraceptive purposes. A 14th century manuscript warns that the evacuation of blood beyond measure brings death, not healing. But this knowledge was slow to spread, and many practitioners continued to drain dangerous amounts of blood from desperate women. The irony of bloodletting for birth control was that it often achieved the opposite of what women wanted. Instead of giving them control over their fertility, it often killed them outright or left them so weakened that they died in their next pregnancy. The cure had become worse than the condition it was meant to treat. In a small stone house in 14th century Bruges, a woman named Margot was sitting naked in a room heated to unbearable temperatures, while her sister poured scalding water over heated stones to create even more intense heat. Margot had been told that extreme heat applied to a woman's body could burn away the seeds of life and prevent unwanted pregnancy. What neither woman understood was that Margot was about to die from hypothermia and severe burns in one of medieval medicine's most brutal contraceptive methods. The heat treatment method was based on medieval understanding of the four humors and the belief that pregnancy resulted from an excess of cold, moist humors in the womb. Physicians reasoned that applying extreme heat would dry out these excess humors and create an environment hostile to conception. This logic seemed sound to medieval minds, but it failed to account for the human body's inability to survive extreme temperatures. Margot would have been subjected to what medieval texts called the fire cure, a treatment that involved multiple forms of dangerous heat exposure. First, she would be placed in a room heated by multiple fires until the temperature reached levels that would be dangerous even for short periods. Then, heated stones or metal objects would be placed against her abdomen and back. Finally, she would be forced to drink scalding liquids to heat the body from within. The immediate effects would have been agonizing. As Margot's core body temperature began to rise, she would have experienced severe headaches, nausea, and confusion. Her heart would race as her body desperately tried to cool itself through sweating. But in the superheated room, sweat would evaporate almost immediately, providing no relief. Medieval physicians had no understanding of heat stroke or hypothermia, but they could observe the effects of their treatments. A 13th century medical manuscript describes a woman undergoing heat treatment. Her skin burns red as fire, and she speaks words of madness. Though we apply the cure for cooling humors, she seems to burn from within. They were witnessing the early stages of heat stroke, a condition that would prove fatal without immediate cooling. But the external burns were just as dangerous as the internal overheating. The heated stones and metal objects used in the treatment would reach temperatures of several hundred degrees. When pressed against Margot's skin, they would cause third-degree burns that would destroy not just the surface skin, but the underlying muscle and tissue as well. A surviving account from a 15th century hospital in Paris describes the aftermath of heat treatment. The woman's flesh was burned black in places, and blisters covered her belly like great boils. Where the hot iron had touched, the skin fell away in pieces. She lived 3 days in great agony before God took mercy on her soul. The physicians were documenting severe burns and subsequent infection, though they understood neither condition properly. The scalding liquids were perhaps the most immediately dangerous aspect of the treatment. Women were forced to drink boiling water, heated wine, or hot oils to balance the humors from within. These liquids would cause horrific burns to the mouth, throat, and stomach. The pain would be so severe that many women would go into shock immediately. Margot's throat and esophagus would be seared by the scalding liquids, making it impossible for her to swallow or even breathe normally. Her stomach lining would be destroyed, causing internal bleeding that would be invisible to medieval physicians. She would vomit blood repeatedly as her damaged digestive system tried to cope with the trauma. The combination of external burns and internal overheating would push Margot's body beyond its ability to survive. Her blood pressure would spike as her heart worked frantically to cool her body, then crash as she went into shock from the burns and blood loss. Her kidneys would begin to fail as her blood flow became chaotic and insufficient. What makes the heat treatment particularly tragic is that it was often administered by other women, mothers, sisters, and friends who genuinely believed they were providing life-saving medicine. These women would watch their loved ones suffer and die, never understanding that they were the agents of that death. Medieval medical theory suggested that the heat treatment needed to be applied repeatedly to be effective. Women who survived the first session would be subjected to additional treatments, each one weakening them further. Their bodies would never have a chance to heal from the burns before being subjected to fresh trauma. The psychological torture was almost as bad as the physical pain. Margot would be fully conscious during much of the treatment, experiencing every moment of agony as her body was systematically burned and overheated. The knowledge that this torture was supposed to be medicine would add a layer of psychological trauma to the physical suffering. The class dynamics of heat treatment were particularly cruel. Wealthy women might have access to bathhouses or specially constructed heated rooms that could maintain more controlled temperatures. Poor women were more likely to be treated in crude conditions, perhaps locked in small rooms with uncontrolled fires, or subjected to improvised heating methods that were even more dangerous. Medieval texts show that some practitioners were beginning to recognize the dangers of extreme heat treatment. A 14th century manuscript warns that fire applied without measure brings death, not healing to the womb. But this knowledge was slow to spread, and many continued to subject women to potentially lethal temperatures. The supply of heat was unlimited. Any woman with access to fire could attempt this treatment. Unlike other methods that required special ingredients or tools, heat treatment could be attempted anywhere with simple materials. This accessibility made it popular, but it also meant that there was no quality control or standardization of the procedures. What's most heartbreaking is that heat treatment was often recommended by medical authorities as a gentle alternative to more invasive procedures. Women were told that they were choosing a natural, non-toxic method of birth control. They had no way of knowing that they were subjecting themselves to a torture that would rival anything inflicted on medieval criminals. The irony of heat treatment was that it often achieved its goal through the worst possible means. The severe trauma to the reproductive system would indeed prevent pregnancy, but only because it destroyed the organs entirely or killed the woman outright. Those who survived were often left with a permanent damage that would make future pregnancies impossible or extremely dangerous. As we reach the end of these 7 horrific methods, it's crucial to understand that we're not just talking about medical history. We're talking about human beings. Real women with names, families, hopes, and dreams who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Consider the mathematics of survival that drove these decisions. A medieval woman faced roughly a 10% chance of dying in any given pregnancy. Over the course of 8 to 12 pregnancies, those odds became increasingly terrifying. Many women were essentially playing Russian roulette with death every time they conceived. But the methods available to prevent pregnancy were often just as deadly as childbirth itself. Women faced a horrific choice: certain suffering through endless pregnancies or possible death through prevention. In many cases, they were trading one form of potential death for another. What's most heartbreaking is that these women showed incredible courage and determination in their attempts to control their own lives. They were willing to risk everything: their health, their lives, even their eternal souls, according to medieval Christian doctrine, to make their own choices about motherhood. The social isolation these women faced compounds the tragedy. Using contraception was often considered sinful, illegal, or both. Women couldn't openly discuss their methods or learn from others' experiences. They were forced to rely on whispered advice, incomplete information, and dangerous folklore. Yet, even in the face of such terrible odds, medieval women found ways to help each other. They shared knowledge, pooled resources, and supported each other through the consequences of their choices. The networks of midwives, wise women, and female healers represented a parallel medical system dedicated to serving women's needs, even when that service proved deadly. It's also important to recognize that these dangerous methods existed precisely because safer alternatives were not available. Medieval society provided women with no education about their own bodies, no safe contraceptive methods, and no legal control over their reproductive lives. Desperation drove them to these extreme measures. The stories we've explored represent just a fraction of the suffering endured by medieval women in their attempts to control their fertility. For every documented case of death or injury, there were likely dozens more that went unrecorded. The true scope of this tragedy will never be fully known. But these women's stories deserve to be remembered, not as cautionary tales, but as testimony to human resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. They remind us that the desire to control one's own reproductive destiny is as old as humanity itself, and that women have always been willing to take extraordinary risks to exercise that control. As we close this exploration of medieval contraceptive methods, we're left with a profound appreciation for how far we've come, and a sobering reminder of how recently these horrors were a reality for women. The 7 methods we've examined, poisonous plants, mercury, lead, copper, bloodletting, and extreme heat, represent more than just dangerous medical practices. They represent the lengths to which women have always been willing to go to control their own destinies. These weren't acts of ignorance or superstition. They were acts of desperate courage by women who refused to accept that endless pregnancy was their only option. Every woman who consumed Queen Anne's lace seeds despite the risk of convulsions, every woman who endured mercury poisoning despite its assault on her mind, every woman who submitted to bloodletting despite watching others die from it. These women were pioneers. They were fighting for a principle that we now take for granted: the right to determine when and whether to become a mother. Their sacrifices paved the way for the medical advances that followed. The recognition that these methods were dangerous helped drive the development of safer alternatives. The courage these women showed in seeking control over their fertility helped establish the principle that reproductive choice is a fundamental human right. Today, we have access to contraceptive methods that are not only safe, but highly effective. We understand the science behind fertility and pregnancy in ways that would seem miraculous to medieval minds. We have legal protections for reproductive rights that medieval women could never have imagined. But this progress is neither universal nor secure. Even today, women in many parts of the world lack access to safe contraception and face the same impossible choices that confronted their medieval sisters. The fight for reproductive autonomy continues, and the courage of medieval women reminds us why that fight matters. The next time you hear debates about contraceptive access or reproductive rights, remember Marguerite grinding poisonous seeds by candlelight. Remember Isabel consuming mercury in her desperate attempt to avoid another pregnancy. Remember Gisela submitting to bloodletting that would cost her life. Remember that the desire to control one's reproductive destiny is so fundamental that women have always been willing to risk everything for it. These medieval women couldn't have imagined the world we live in today. A world where pregnancy can be prevented safely and effectively, where women can pursue education and careers, where motherhood can be a choice rather than an inevitability. Their suffering helped make this world possible. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as medical history, but as human history. They remind us that progress is never inevitable, that rights once gained can be lost, and that the courage to fight for reproductive autonomy is as relevant today as it was 700 years ago. In remembering these women, we honor not just their suffering, but their strength. They faced impossible choices with remarkable courage, and their legacy lives on in every woman who has the freedom to choose her own reproductive destiny. Their stories deserve to be told, their courage deserves to be recognized, and their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. If you found these stories as fascinating and heartbreaking as I did, make sure to subscribe for more hidden histories that illuminate the human experience across the centuries. And let me know in the comments, what other aspects of medieval women's lives would you like to explore? These stories matter, and they deserve to be told.